Okay, reporting is in progress. Okay, got it. Let's do it. Hello, my name is Ruben Badalian, and this is my show or podcast, The Business of Languages and History. And this is my guest, Luke Angstadt, and he's also the author of the,
The Musings of De La Pew.
of De La Pew, which is a 20-year investigation into the universe and all the topics related to that. So without further ado, today we will talk about the history of Yugoslavia or Yugoslav history. So if you don't, for our audience who don't know what Yugoslavia is was a country, or basically kind of like a federation of 6 different countries or republics, like Serbia, that consists of Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Kosovo. So 6 republics it consisted of. So, and also the idea.
And Ruben, I mean, I got the impression, like before we were talking about the history of the Soviet Union, and I got the impression that maybe the history of Yugoslavia had a lot of similarities with the Soviet Union, and that might be part of the reason why you're interested in both of them, is because of there's a lot that's similar there. Is that true? Because I don't know, Ruben. This isn't my field of expertise.
I mean, yes, it's true. They were both like similar communist nations, but they were very different. From Yugoslavia was a different communist nation compared to the Soviet Union. I'll get into that later on. So prior to the creation of Yugoslavia, Balkan Peninsula was under Ottoman Empire for 500 years, for 5 decades. The whole Balkan Peninsula was under the Ottoman occupation. And so for 500 years, Serbia and other countries were fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire, which is present day, or now Turkey, the Republic of Turkey. And so during that time, the idea of Yugoslavia originated. It did not happen until the end of World War I, but the idea of Yugoslavia came by a small group of Slavs, mostly South Slavs like Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians. And so after the end, before World War I, all Balkan Peninsula had its own country. Like Serbia had its own country. It was once a kingdom, and Bulgaria was also a kingdom, and Greece was also a kingdom, and then they had their own country. They had their own country, and so basically.
Hey, Ruben, you bring up a really great point. So when was Yugoslavia formed? Was that formed before World War I or after World War I?
After World War I.
Oh, so it was okay. So these were all independent nations.
Yes, that's right.
World War I. So this was kind of like after the Treaty of Versailles. That's when we saw the unification of these countries into Yugoslavia.
Yes, that's right. And so, and before all Yugoslavia and before World War I, there was a lot of wars between different Balkan nations, like for example, Serbia and Turkey, Turkey and Greece, or Ottoman Empire and Greek War, Serbian-Ottoman War, Bulgarian-Serbian War. Serbia was fighting a war against Bulgaria because they had their differences. And so, and then also in the 1910s, that was also when there was a Balkan Wars. There were 2 Balkan Wars in that peninsula. That was between Serbia was fighting Bulgaria, Serbia was fighting Turkey, and etc. The Ottoman Empire. And so
now, Ruben, quick question has Turkey been the aggressor historically? I mean, who has been the aggressor more often than not? Do you know what I mean? Because Turkey, I mean, they're big. I mean, the Ottoman Empire. I mean, I know who they are, and have they been trying to take over these smaller nations? Is that kind of like what's going on?
Yes, that's right. That's what they've done for 500 years. They occupied Balkan nations like Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, Montenegro, and so on and so forth. Those nations, and Greece too. And so. And then Balkan Peninsula was under that Ottoman Empire. And then World War I actually started with the assassination in Sarajevo, Bosnia, by a small Serbian terrorist organization against the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Because if you remember, there were a large European empires like the Russian Empire, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Serbia was a small kingdom, and Bulgaria was also a small kingdom. And so
Ruben, that's interesting. That's a really interesting historical fact that you mentioned, Ruben, because I didn't know that at all. I mean, so for example, World War II. I mean, when I think of World War II, I think of Germany invading Poland in 1939, and I
Yeah,
also think of Pearl Harbor, obviously, December 1941. That's what brought the United States into the war.
that's right.
But as far as, I mean, World War One, that
Yeah.
little historical detail of what started World War One. I knew nothing about that, Ruben. I mean, I
Wow.
knew about the Treaty of Versailles. I know about how much Germany was punished by the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, the Treaty of Versailles pretty
Huh.
much brought Germany to its knees. I mean, it decimated their economy. It brought the entire GDP of Germany to a fraction of a penny practically. But
Increase.
what you just said right there, it is crazy, Ruben. But what you said there with what started World War One, that's an interesting historical tidbit that
Right.
it's not common knowledge, Ruben. So I'm glad you mentioned it. And could you repeat it for our audience, because I was unfamiliar with it too.
Okay, so what happened? What event started World War One was this assassination in Sarajevo, Bosnia. But at that time, it was under the Hungarian Empire.
Oh, okay.
So Austria-Hungary, that was an empire that consisted of like Ukraine, Austria, Hungary, some parts of Slovenia, some parts of Croatia, and Bosnia.
Hmm.
And so that's how the war started in World War One started with the assassination of the Archduke in Bosnia, Sarajevo.
Oh,
Because the reason for the assassination was because a small Serbian terrorist organization group led by Garijevo Princip, or was the secret terrorist Serbian organization. It was called the Black Hand,
hmm,
Crna Ruka in Serbian
hmm,
language. And so they caused that assassination. And so Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, the Kingdom of Serbia. And so Russia, the Russian Empire, in support of Serbia, had decided to support Serbia because Russia and Serbia are our allies because they're both Slavic nations, basically.
okay.
They share the same common interests as each other. They're both Orthodox nations. Serbia and Russia are both Orthodox countries.
Or are they both Orthodox Catholics? You mean like are they Eastern Orthodox? I mean, is
Eastern
it
Orthodox,
so they
Eastern
have the same?
Orthodox,
So
yeah.
yeah, so they have. I mean, they have like they're like the
Orthodox.
core of their religious belief, and
Yes, that's right.
that influences their culture. They had that similarity, so that lended itself to them being allies.
Allies with Serbia, basically.
Mhm,
Yeah. So
mhm,
Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Ukraine, all those other Slavic nations, they're all Orthodox, basically.
mhm, mhm.
So, and then on July 28th, 1914, that was when Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, and that's how World War One started.
Okay.
So 4 years later, in 1918, oh no, actually, in 1915, that was when Serbia was destroyed. Like it was under the German occupation. It was defeated by Serbia was defeated by the Germans, Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. And so Serbia was destroyed, and Serbian army and the king had retreated through the mountains of Albania and then Montenegro, and then they set up their own base in Greece. The Serbian army had their government in exile in Greece,
Okay.
basically. And so they were there for 3 years, from 1915 to 1918.
Oh wow.
And then the whole Serbian army was there. And during that march, it was so cold. It was during the winter time and fall time,
Mhm.
and all Serbian army was frozen, like because they were so cold, and they were marching through the mountains of Albania and Montenegro, and then they were frozen to death because it was super cold there.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, and then the Serbs were fighting the Germans, the Bulgarians, and Ottomans and Austrian-Hungarian troops from Greece, and that's where they were fighting those guys for those nations for 3 years. And then
Mhm.
3 years later, in 1918, Yugoslavia was formed, and that's how Yugoslavia was a country. And then it was first a kingdom, and then it was a communist country. But without further ado, we'll talk about the kingdom era of
So,
Yugoslavia.
Ruben, quick question for you. Quick question for you, Ruben. Were there any of the former Slavic countries that opposed the formation of Yugoslavia, or were they all in agreement that they?
All agreed with
Oh, they did. Okay.
Yugoslavia. Like
Okay.
after World War II, like all the European empires, like Russia had collapsed. The Russian Empire had collapsed because there was a Russian Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and his communist Bolshevik
Mhm,
organization. And
mhm.
all German Empire was wiped out and the whole
Okay.
economy was destroyed there. And then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed as well.
Okay.
were defeated. And Ottoman Empire would soon collapse as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so Yugoslavia was first a kingdom. It was called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. That was basically consisted of those three ethnicities. But then Yugoslavia, that was a kingdom for some time. And then Yugoslavia also had kings. They also had Peter the First, who was the previous king of Serbia during World War I. And so he was also the founder, or no, not the founder. He was also the head of the dynasty of Serbia. There was the Karađorđević dynasty. That was dynasty, one of the dynasties in Serbia. Because if you remember, because for our audience who don't know, there was a dynasty. There were two dynasties. There was the Obrenović dynasty and the Karađorđević dynasty. So that was two dynasties there. And so one of the dynasties was ultimately went to extinct because all the family members in the Obrenović dynasty was all executed, because there were those two dynasties, the Karađorđević and Obrenović dynasty. They were all kind of having a struggle for power in Serbia during the kingdom era of Serbia before Yugoslavia. And so King Peter the First of Yugoslavia, he ruled Yugoslavia for 3 years, and then he from 1918 to 1921, and then he basically died of old age, basically.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so
how old was he? How old was he?
I think he was in his 80s, I think.
Pretty
so
old.
Yeah. And so then he was succeeded by Alexander the First. And so during that time, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia soon became a dictatorship under his rule. And then he would rule the country from 1921 all the way until 1934, when he was assassinated in France by Bulgarian by a Croatian terrorist organization, fascist organization, the Ustaša. But the assassin who actually killed Alexander the First was a Bulgarian terrorist, and then he was also during that time there was a lot of tensions between the Serbs and Croatian people, because there was an assassination in Belgrade by a Serbian organization that killed one of the Croatian politicians there in the parliament in Belgrade, and that sparked a huge tension between Serbs and Croatians that been going on for a century now, almost a century. So.
Ruben, I have a quick question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of what kind of governments did they have in Yugoslavia, and even the countries that the Slavic countries prior to the formation of the Yugoslavia? Were they communist countries? Were they democracies? Were they monarchies? What kind of government?
Most of the Balkan countries in that region, like for example Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Greece, Romania, they were all kingdoms. Some of them were kingdoms.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, but
so were they kind of like monarchies then too?
Yes, that's right. They had their own kings basically in that area.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And those are oftentimes dictatorships, right? I mean, oftentimes a kingdom and a monarchy is a dictatorship, so the people are ruled by, it's
basically
basically.
Mm-hmm. But after World War II, all the Balkan countries would become communist except for Greece.
Oh, okay.
Because it can't be a Western nation like the United States and West Germany, and so on and so forth. So following the assassination of King Alexander the First, he was succeeded by what was his name? King Peter the Second. He was very young of age, so he was 11 years of age when he was made the king of Yugoslavia. So he was very
that's hard to believe. Not hard to believe, but wow. So 11 years old in the 20th century, and you are the king. So it's obviously they're following a bloodline, right? I mean, there isn't a free election. There's no representative there's no representative government. I mean, it's just it's the succession of the bloodline, right? I mean, that's the only way any 11-year-old becomes the leader of a country, which is it's ridiculous, right? It is kind of silly. What do you think, Ruben? What do you think about that?
If you're 11-year-old and you become the king, what's your move? Because you are given this huge responsibilities.
Well, Ruben, you know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, the people that are surrounding you are going to usurp power because they realize that you have no power. When you're 11 years old, you don't have any. I mean, of course, you don't have any power. So it gives the opportunity for the people surrounding him to
Yes.
step in and rule. Yeah.
That's right. And so World War II would soon arrive around the corner, because by 1939, Nazi Germany, under the dictatorship of Hitler, invaded Poland, and that's how all this war started. World War II started. And so 2 years later, 1941 comes, and then all Germany would occupy all Europe, but they wanted to conquer Yugoslavia and Greece. And so they would soon do that, but then they wanted to sign a peaceful treaty with Yugoslavia, so Yugoslavia would join the alliance of Nazi Germany. But then, like the prime minister would soon sign an agreement with Yugoslavia. Oh no, with Nazi Germany. But then some military officers in the Yugoslav army were against the idea of Yugoslavia joining the alliance with Germany. And soon some Air Force officers in the Yugoslav Air Force would soon overthrow the prime minister and replace him with someone new. And then, so it was a military coup there, basically. So Yugoslavia was not allies with Germany, Nazi Germany, for at least a short time.
And so after the coup d'etat, Ruben, what kind of government did they install?
Well, they replaced some new government officials there, like who were willing to stand up against Germany. And then this angered Hitler, who was very angry at the time. And so Hitler ordered the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece because he was very angry. He was very furious, and he ordered the invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. And so on April 6, 1941, that was when Nazi Germany with their allies like Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria, they would soon invade Yugoslavia. And so all Yugoslavia would be under their occupation, because the Yugoslavia did not have time to prepare for the war or the invasion by Germany and their allies. And all Yugoslavia would be under their control. I think it was between maybe around 12 days, Yugoslavia was brought under German control. So, and I mean, the Yugoslav government, they fled the country because they didn't want it to be under German occupation. And then they had a government in exile. And so Yugoslav government, they basically fled from, I think it was from Montenegro, because Montenegro was one of the nations of Yugoslavia. And they fled from Montenegro, and then they fled from Egypt, Israel, and then they arrived in London, where most of the other government exiles were.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So they realized that they had no shot. They had no hope to stand their ground.
Basically. And so meanwhile, in Yugoslavia, while Yugoslavia was under German occupation, there were two different resistances. That was the communist resistance that was led by Joseph Broz Tito. I will tell you more who Tito is in the future. And there was another resistance called the Chetniks organization that was led by Draza Mihailovic. So these men were two very different. And so they had different ideologies, because Draza Mihailovic wanted to basically restore the kingdom to Yugoslavia. But on the other hand, Joseph Broz Tito wanted to make Yugoslavia a communist nation, like the Soviet Union, basically. So
Ruben, where are we at in the time frame here? We're talking World War I now, right? We're in the middle of World War I.
World War II. World War II.
I mean, excuse me, I misspoke. I meant World War II.
Like, I said 1941.
1941. That's what I thought. Yeah. Okay.
That was when all Yugoslavia and Greece was under German occupation. And so and those two men I mentioned, Draza Mihailovic and Josip Broz Tito, those were the leaders of two resistance movements in Yugoslavia. And so they were basically had their own ideas and ideologies. And so the Draza Mihailovic and his Chetnik organizations had their headquarters in Ravna Gora. That was in Bosnia. I think that was somewhere in Bosnia or Serbia. I think that's where they had their headquarters. And that's where they would fight against the German occupation. And so Tito would organize a communist or resistance movement, and he would soon organize a uprising in Serbia to overthrow or attempt to overthrow the German or Nazi occupation, but that would soon be suppressed by German authorities there.
Okay. All right. So what was the outcome at the end of what happened to Yugoslavia at the end of World War II?
Well, Yugoslavia at the end of World War II, it would soon become a communist nation. But before that, Yugoslavia had people who were working for the Germans, like collaboralists, basically.
Collaborated, yeah, sure.
Yeah, there was some collaboralist governments that were set up in Yugoslavia, like in Serbia and Croatia. They were carrying out large genocide campaigns against like Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies, basically. Croatian people were committing genocide against Serbs, Gypsies, and Jews. And there was a lot of tensions between Serbs and Croatians to this day still. And so, in Serbia, they had their own fascist government, a collaboralist government. And then they had this, the dictator or fascist dictator there, he would like basically save Serbs that were being killed from Croatian people. So he was kind of like viewed as a hero to Serb people, the fascist dictator who was saving the Serbs being executed from the Croats.
So how long was Yugoslavia under a communist regime? I mean, did they outlive the Soviet Union? I mean, as far as I really don't. I mean, it's been a while since I remember this being in the news, Ruben. But when was the end to the Yugoslavia? When did the Yugoslavia unfold and then break into these other Slavic countries again? I mean, did it kind of mirror the breakdown of the Soviet Union, or was it before or after?
Well, Yugoslavia became a communist nation after the end of World War II, because if you remember.
So Ruben, I guess my question is, how long was it a communist nation, Yugoslavia?
Basically, almost for 40 years, like almost 40 years, because I think it was from 1945. That was when all war ended and World War II was over. And so, 1945, that was when Yugoslavia became communist nation. And so communism in Yugoslavia fell sometime in 1990s, 1991, 1992.
Oh, okay. So it was probably after the fall of the Soviet Union then.
Yes, that's right. All communist nations were coming down. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I didn't know that, Ruben. I remember a kid, but I remember as a kid, I remember hearing about the Yugoslavia, and it kind of mirrored it. I mean, the story was kind of ongoing with the Soviet Union and then the fall of the Soviet Union, but I didn't remember. I didn't recall the exact time frame when it happened. So it happened in the early 90s. Okay. Yeah. And then what happened? Did those countries break out into civil war after the fall of communism?
Yes, that's right.
What happened to those? Yeah, what happened to those countries, Ruben?
That's basically, so there was a civil war. There were some problems because like Serbia did not want all these small federations to leave, basically. They did not want them to like declare their independence and break away from Yugoslavia. Like, for example, two nations or two of the federal republics or federation republics of Yugoslavia, like Croatia, Slovenia, they declared they're all independent, but then Serbia attacked those nations. And so they did not want them to leave the Yugoslavia, but they did instead. And then also a civil war would break out in those parts of the former Yugoslavia.
So how many casualties were there reported after these civil wars, after the breakdown of Yugoslavia?
I think it was between 1,000 or a million. I think I'm not. Those rumor on the street is that the civil wars in Yugoslavia were the deadliest wars in Europe since World War II.
Wow. Yeah, that's sad. Wow, that's really sad.
That's the story.
So, Ruben, where does it bring us up to the present day? What are the relations like between these Slavic nations today? What's it like living over there today? I mean, are they still? I mean, if not at war with each other, or have they found any kind of peace between each other, or what? I guess what I'm saying is, what is the relationship between these countries that previously composed the former Yugoslavia? How do they get along with each other today?
Well, there's no war there obviously now because there's still some tensions because like some Serbs don't like Bosnians or some Serbs don't like Croatians because Serbs were killing Bosnians because they were Muslim.
That Ruben, that's a great point. I mean, I was going to ask you, are these is the conflict, is it primary, is it more political, is it religious, because you do have the Muslims there coexisting with the Christians? I mean, are these battles oftentimes religious, or are they more political? And like the differences in political ideologies, what usually what I mean, it's what do you think it is? I mean, is it usually religion? Because I mean, religion.
Both.
Yeah.
It's both.
Both. Okay. Yeah.
Political and religious. They were fighting over that. They were fighting over religion and politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because they were saying like, oh, Bosnia was under the control of Ottoman Empire for 500 years, and all Serbia and all the other places were under Ottoman Empire for 500 years. So yeah, and then that was really bloody civil war there. And so like, and Croatian civil war in Croatia broke out in 1991. So same year when Soviet Union came down, and then it ended in 1995. And then civil war or war in Bosnia started in 1992, same year when communism in Yugoslavia came down, or when it started to break apart. And then the Bosnian War all started, I think it was because of a shooting at a Bosnian wedding in Sarajevo, the capital city of Sarajevo, or they wanted to withdraw from Yugoslavia. And then Kosovo started, it was in 1998 or sometime like that. So, and then
yeah, I was in high school at the time. Yeah. So was there a large exodus of people from these countries? I mean, were they fleeing to Western Europe or the United States? I mean,
that's right. That's right. There was like a lot of Bosnians, a lot of Croatians and Serbs. They started to like, there was a large exodus, as you have stated earlier. So they started to flee like to Western Europe, Australia, United States, and there was a lot of huge Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian communities in those areas.
That's interesting that you mentioned Australia, Ruben, because a lot of people from a lot of people in Southeast Asia that have lived under communist regimes, that have been in civil war and just really ongoing conflict. That I mean, their everyday life is very difficult. They've gone to Australia too. So a lot of people go to Australia in addition to the United States and Western Europe. So yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that.
So a lot of people prior to the Civil War in Yugoslavia had a great life, because like it was much different compared to Soviet Union Yugoslavia.
Oh wow.
I mean, Yugoslavia was kind of a mix of capitalist and communist nation. So it was kind of a mix of both, basically. It was an independent communist nation. So basically, like, people in Yugoslavia had the right to travel, they had the right to go abroad, but in Soviet Union was much different compared to that in Soviet Union. So I mean, Yugoslavia had presidents and prime ministers, and vice presidents, kind of like the United States does now.
That's a very interesting point you bring up, Ruben, that they were free to travel, and that they had a combination of, I mean, the combination of capitalism and communism. I mean, the distinctions between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. I mean, yeah, that's very interesting, Ruben. So I mean, there are different wrinkles to communism. So I find that very fascinating.
That's right. And so like, the Yugoslavia, that was what was it? Like this, it was much different compared to Soviet Union. Then they had the different leaders. They had like, but in Soviet Union you had like general secretary. In Yugoslavia you had like a president, basically. So different political structure in those two nations. And so like, Tito was president of Yugoslavia after World War II ended. And so during his rule, it was kind of peaceful because the economy was doing very well in Yugoslavia. But then when Tito died, the Yugoslav president died in 1980, all Yugoslavia was kind of like Yugoslav economy started to collapse or started to break apart, and unemployment rates started to increase. And a lot of national tension started to break out. And so, and then also there was a time in late early 70s, that was like a time when there was a lot of reforms were needed to be brought into the government, also known as the Croatian Springs. That was like basically to reform the Yugoslav government. and that was and Croatia basically.
Oh, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And there was also
no, go ahead. Please go ahead.
There were also three powerful men in Yugoslavia. That was Joseph Broz Tito, as I told you, but so it's also an interesting fact because I'll tell you later. And so the second band was what was it? Edward Kralj, I think that was how you pronounce his name, and then there was Aleksandar Rukovic. So those were three very powerful men of Yugoslavia. And it's also very interesting of mentioning because Joseph Broz Tito was not his real name in the same way like Stalin's was not his real name. That was his nickname, basically. So those are two similarities between the Soviet leader Stalin and Yugoslav leader Tito.
Kind of like Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, right? That was, I mean, he had a different name, right? So that's very interesting, Ruben. That's a very interesting point you make. Yeah. So why did they take it? Why did they take on different names? What was the reasons for having like a not even a pseudonym? Well, I mean, I guess it is a pseudonym. But what was the reasoning behind having these, fictitious names, if you will?
Well, Stalin, I don't know that story, or Tito, I don't know that story either, or Lenin, I don't know that story.
It's interesting, though. I mean, the correlation is interesting, Ruben.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And then like Yugoslavia, the relations between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union were not that good because like there was a time in late 40s after World War II ended, there was like Stalin and the Tito's relationship with each other started to deteriorate, and so that's why all Yugoslavia and Soviet Union relationships started to break apart, and they were no longer allies. And so there was a time in late 70s and early 80s, there was a time when Yugoslavia economy was starting to break apart after Tito's death, and so or before Tito's death, and then Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev wanted to give assistance to Yugoslavia, but Tito, on the other hand, refused to give assistance to Yugoslavia.
I was going to ask you, Ruben, what was the biggest problem? What was the biggest problem that the Soviet Union had with Yugoslavia? I mean, why didn't they get along? Because they had similar ideologies. I mean, do you think it's just because the Soviet Union wanted to absorb Yugoslavia? I mean, it's like the bigger animal wants to consume the smaller animal, or was there another reason for that?
That's largely the way it works out, but then like they have different ideologies because Soviet Union was just a communist nation, and then Yugoslavia was an independent communist nation. It was a mix of West and East, as I told you earlier.
Interesting. That's a very interesting distinction there, Ruben. It really is. Yeah, because they're still communists, but with more of the Western influence in Yugoslavia. I didn't know that, but that's fascinating. Yeah.
And so Croatia was one of the republics, same as Bosnia, Serbia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and so on. But then like Kosovo, there was a lot of ethnic Albanians and a lot of Kosovo Serbs, and there was a lot of tensions in that part of the world, and that would ultimately lead to the war in Kosovo that would happen in late 90s and early 2000s. So.
Oh, okay.
And then all Yugoslavia, I mean, communism in Yugoslavia dissolved in 1991, but then in 2000, sometime in the 2000, I think it was in 2008, that was when all Yugoslavia came down.
Oh, okay.
So 14 years ago.
And when did that, I mean, I remember what happened in Kosovo. When did that finally reach its conclusion? I mean, that was early 2000s. So, I mean, are any of these countries still at civil war right now, Ruben, or how long have
they're
not? Okay. When did the civil wars come to an end?
Civil wars in Yugoslavia came to an end in sometime in 2000, 2001. So you're right.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. That's right.
So do these these Slavic countries, do they get along right now? I mean, what are the relations like right now?
Like some Serbs and Croatians, they have some good friendships with each other. Same with some Bosnians and Serbs and Slovenes, etc. in that part of the world.
But I bet there's still a lot of conflict between the Muslims and the Christians, right? I mean,
Orthodox
that usually happens, right?
Yeah. And there was also one time when the formation of Yugoslavia happened. There was also one time when Serbia tried to invite Bulgaria and to former Yugoslavia to be one of the republics of Yugoslavia, but Bulgaria declined. partly because the Serbia and Bulgaria had tensions in the past, but they're also two Slavic nations, like, and they were allies, like Serbia is with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. And
The
that brings us up to date from the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, right?
That's right. And then also that part of the world has been very interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously,
It is,
because
yeah.
it has a lot of tensions, and there was a lot of interesting, complicated history in that area of the world. So yeah.
Well, I mean, they're taking it from many different angles, right? Because I mean, the Turks they've always had an uncomfortable, not even uncomfortable. I mean, they've had a hostile relationship with the Turks, right? And then they've had a hostile relationship from the Russians. So I mean, that part of the world is kind of, I mean, they're taking it from, I mean, they are receiving hostile, threats to their way of life from multiple countries, right? I mean, from the Ottoman Empire. I mean, Turkey still.
Yeah.
Turkey's Turkey. I mean, Turkey is still a very large country, as is Russia, of course, too. So I mean, these smaller nations that are trying to, protect and secure and sustain their way of life. I mean, because they are surrounded by these massive empires, right? Their way of life is always under threat, it seems, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, then like Serbs are Orthodox, like that's why they're friends with like Russians and Greeks, because they're also Orthodox too. They have a similar culture with each other. So yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. So Ruben, well, I mean, we're coming up on 2 minutes here, so we'll probably wrap up this podcast and extend and we'll pick up the conversation where we left off here. But what do you think? Where do you want to take this next time? So we've covered the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia. Where do you want to go next time?
History of the Balkan region.
The Balkan region. So just so our audience knows, giving them like a preview of sorts. I mean, next time we're on the podcast, we're going to discuss the Balkans.
And also different like Yugoslav, Serb, and other leaders during that time. So yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it, Ruben, because a lot of this is still new to me. I mean, I studied this when I was in grade school and like middle school. So I remember taking like 7th, 8th, 9th grade civics and current affairs. But a lot of because a lot of this was happening in the early a lot of things were unfolding in the 1990s.
That's right.
In this part of the world. But a lot of this is new to me, Ruben. So I am excited. I'm enjoying this, and I'm learning a lot here. So thank you for having me on.
No problem.
All right. So we're at about a minute here. So you think this is a good place to wrap it up, and we will talk to you later.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's good.
All right. So say goodbye to our audience for now, right? And we will see them on the next one. All right. I'll see you, Ruben.
See you.
It's been a lot of fun. I'll see you.
See you.
Okay.
Okay.